Alright, this is for U.S. Survey, Part 2, and this is starting off Week 5 with the introduction called the Eve of Destruction on page 528. As I recall mentioning to you every time, this is where we jump ahead in the action in the intro and then start back fresh in the chronology in Chapter 1. I want to start out here. This is essentially talking about the beginning of the Cold War, or kind of diving into it to give you a little bit of taste of what's coming, specifically speaking about the problems that we deal with one-on-one with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do make sure to read about this. Our relationship with the Soviet Union and with Cuba has never fully been reconciled from this point. In Chapter 1, there's several terms you'll want to know for your test. Do keep in mind that you'll want to kind of follow along with your study guide. It might be helpful to you to make notes or at least to highlight in your book where you find certain things. But this starts out with the Grand Alliance. After the war ended, we're talking about 6 years of war, tens of millions of combatants killed, millions of civilians, 10 million from the Holocaust, and of course, as you know, that number, I've seen it as high as 18 million, and then several numbers in between. That number kind of fluctuates, probably based on who you ask as far as what researcher is doing, and then maybe how they report those numbers. So that's a pretty conservative estimate. The lowest I've heard is 8 million, I think. So, that Grand Alliance is Roosevelt, President of the United States, Prime Minister Winston Churchill from Great Britain, and then the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who is going to be an interesting relationship here because, as you might imagine, Churchill and Roosevelt get along pretty famously, very similar interests, certainly a better feeling of what the world looks like post-war. And then you have Stalin, who's communist, he's combative, he's suspicious, and he is well, he's crazy. How about that? But as we see this alliance unfolding, this ends up being more about convenience. That's the word your book uses, and it works really nicely. It doesn't stay intact for long. It's essentially to bring the war to an end, but other than that, there is not enough of a shared camaraderie there to make that happen, and this is what opens the door for the Cold War. Now, when we talk about Cold War, you do know certainly there's no real outbreak of war as a result of this. It's just lingering. It's always on the surface. You ought to ask your parents or your grandparents about this era and talk about doing the bomb drills where they race under their desk in hopes of protecting their head or their body from an impending atomic attack, those sort of things. That really does define their generation in so many ways. In these meetings, in these alliance meetings, Stalin made a number of promises that he never was going to keep or could keep, not the least of which are his promises regarding what he's now set up as pro-Soviet communist governments in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others. It's Truman, who becomes president after Roosevelt suddenly dies, that stands up to him. Roosevelt sort of had a little bit too much of a diplomatic approach with Stalin in comparison to Truman. I'm not laying blame or anything silly like that, but they certainly had different approaches. Truman had a no-nonsense approach with Stalin. He hated communism. He hated Stalin. Psst, that's it. And so he really did not have a lot of time to mess around with Stalin and wasn't going to give him the time of day. In many regards, his hardline approach with Stalin caused a number of extra problems with the Soviets, which is probably part of why Roosevelt did not kind of poke the bear, so to speak. One such instance you see before the war, both the U.S. and the Soviets are kind of trying to keep as, well, your book talks about keeping each other at arm's length, and that's a pretty good way to explain it. It's not even until 1933 that U.S. recognizes the Soviet Union, and it's at this point when they finally have to come together, join forces to bring an end to the Nazi regime. Roosevelt had hoped that the nations that were taken over by the Red Army at the end of the World War would get to choose their own government, but the Soviets feel as if they have liberated these other nations, and so they are now communist regime. They set into place pro-communist leadership that basically take over those nations. The Soviets are determined to set up a security zone, essentially, that protects the Soviets from the rest of the world, and that's what these countries are. They're a buffer zone in so many ways. The idea with communism that your book only barely mentions, one of the ideologies within communism is that they spread it. It's a tenet that goes into communism, and so it's always understood that we need to grow. The irony is that Stalin, while he does want to grow it, he recognizes that in many ways the Soviet Union is still new, and communism has not fully taken shape, and so they need to kind of work in their own general vicinity. And so he does not push too hard on these other countries, probably as overtly as would have been expected by the tenets of their particular belief system. While Stalin and Churchill, Roosevelt, all three of them met several times, once in Iran and then in Yalta, they were able to kind of set up a few guidelines. As I said, many of the things that Stalin promised to, he never intended to ever fully recognize or to follow through on. Roosevelt envisioned a free and democratic Poland, and he got Stalin to promise that he would one day offer free and unfettered elections. Well, this didn't happen until sometime in the 80s or 90s, so it doesn't really follow through. Stalin had long since been gone. What we see here is communism beginning to spread, some of that deliberate and some of it not so much. Stalin wanted to see Germany fully and completely dismembered. No more world wars. It was totally Germany's fault, and so they should be completely dismembered. And so they set up a zone of occupation that each of the different Allied countries could take a chunk of the country of Germany. In that, we see Berlin being a part of the Soviet bloc of East Germany, and so we split Berlin. And so the four countries split, take a small chunk of Berlin as well as the country at large. For a while, Roosevelt continued to believe that eventually Stalin would relent, but it becomes pretty obvious pretty soon that that's not the case at all. On April 12th, Roosevelt suddenly died of a cerebral hemorrhage, thus making Truman the new president and the new leader of the free world. Unfortunately for him, he had only been vice president for less than 3 months. Beyond that, this is still a time period where the president does not really communicate, involve the vice president in a way that Truman walked into office feeling as up to date as possible. As a matter of fact, he was completely lost. So much of what could have happened was lost because Roosevelt and Truman did not have this tight co-leadership type relationship. Matter of fact, your book tells you that he and the president had not spoken much to each other between the election and his death, so he just really was in the dark. But he didn't spend any time wasting. He immediately jumped in. He spent the next several days being debriefed, spending an immense amount of time just quartered in with his highest ranking officials in the cabinets and all the military leadership he could get to, and he was a very quick study. He learned very quickly so that he could decide how to handle things moving forward. He didn't believe Stalin. Nothing that Stalin said he was going to believe. He didn't believe in communism. He saw that all Soviets were untrustworthy, and he was suspicious of anyone that was communist. 10 days following Roosevelt's death, he met with the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. He basically came in to meet with Truman. He was supposed to meet with Stalin. Molotov comes in basically because, well, Stalin doesn't have time for you. And Molotov walks in and he talks to Truman kind of like a dog, treats him very rudely. The story goes that Truman takes it for as long as he can. He finally stands up to him and says, you do not know who I am, apparently. I'm the President of the United States, and you will never, ever speak to me like this again. And if you ever want to know the United States to meet with the Soviets again, you'll send Stalin next time. Basically, really does stand up to him, and this really defines his relationship with the Soviets from here on out. The meeting at Potsdam, you see the Soviets and the United States again coming to a pretty tight line of we're not putting up with this stuff, we're not going to put up with the Soviets, and this is where the dealing with the atomic bomb comes to play. Truman does not know about the atomic bomb before he comes to presidency. And in those days where he's meeting with his cabinet, his first initial meeting with all of those people that are directly impacting the presidency and the executive office, as soon as that meeting is over, Harry Stimson pulls him off to the side and he says, "Mr. President, I need a moment of your time." And it's there that he is told for the very first time of the atomic bomb. This news, I cannot begin to fathom what it means to him. I've read a few letters and a few of his journal entries where he talks about learning of this. Your mind has to be swimming and still asking, is this at all possible? Could this be actually happening? In this, it's not until it's actually test fired that he finds out for sure that it could work. And so he actually finds this out while he's in a meeting at Potsdam. He shares this information with Churchill, but they decide they're not going to tell Stalin. There's a number of reasons that go into this, not the least of which is they're communist, and they don't want the bad guy to get this material, and so they decide on a plan of action that they're going to drop these bombs on Japan if the Japanese will not relent and finally give up. In the meantime, they're working through a number of other issues, not the least of which is China, who at this point is still not communist, but Stalin already has his sights set on it as far as allowing some of the communist ideology to move in with Mao Zedong. In the meantime, we see as the Soviets are taking over their portion of Germany, settling in, they are siphoning money off the German government like crazy. They want reparations. They want payback for what the Nazis did to them when they invaded them. And the Germans cannot handle it. It's destroying their economy. These people cannot eat. They cannot survive. And Stalin apparently expected that the other sections of Germany would pay tribute as well to him to help pay for these fixing of the infrastructure there in the Soviet Union, and of course it doesn't happen. There is a famous speech given on page 534 where Winston Churchill visits the United States, and actually is in Fulton, Missouri. I pass by it every time I go visit my family in Alabama, where he speaks of the symbolic Iron Curtain, and he says it's descended across Europe like one dividing a free and democratic West from the East under totalitarian rule. You do want to know Iron Curtain for your test. It's here that Truman begins to create, adapt, and decide on what he'll call the Truman Doctrine. And this is based on something called containment, the idea that they want to contain communism no matter what. They can't see it grow. They don't want to fight it as far as move into a communist nation and fight it, but instead they want to see if they can't somehow contain it. Within that time period on Chapter 2, page 536, you see Truman's Cold War. He's going to develop something called the Marshall Plan. In that's the European Recovery Program, the ERP. It's approved by Congress in April of 1948. Number one, it's a humanitarian concern for all of Europe. All these countries post-World War are struggling. They cannot take care of themselves. Number two, it's a general concern that if the U.S. doesn't help Europe get back on the feet, we are going to see permanent drain of American resources because we were helping Europe. This was supposed to be a temporary plan. Number three, a desire to further link American goods with European markets and perhaps then counter communism. With this, we see Truman as well as German leaders and world leaders at that are trying to recover from these war wounds, trying to deal with what the world looks like post-war. West Germany emerges as a republic, and we see this growing. Stalin's ticked. He is furious. This isn't what he intended. He's even seeing the three countries that own the portion of Western Germany, they merge and they create this one country, and he is mad. The idea was always, as far as these free world leaders were concerned, was to reconnect the country at large so that there wouldn't be a separated Germany, but it's not looking that way. June 24th, 1948, we see the blockade begin. The three western sections of Berlin, up until this point, people could freely move western to eastern Germany, and so Stalin basically shuts all that back off. Back in April, he had declared that all trains moving in or out of Berlin would be subject to Soviet inspection. This is where he takes it a step further and he shuts them down completely. So Western Berliners, while they are technically a part of the Western world, they are now isolated and kept in check by the Soviets. Truman is determined he will not abandon Western Berlin, and so he ends up sending giant airlifts of food, water, medical supplies, clothing, and blankets as a part of the Berlin airlift for more than 10 months. This turns out to be one of the signals to Stalin that we're not going to give up on these people, and he finally relented in the spring of 1948. As the East and the West are drifting further apart, you see more alliances come into play. You have Benelux countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg. They sign a 50-year alliance of an economic cooperation called the Brussels Pact. You see NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which you need to know for your test. You also see the reaction to that's the Warsaw Treaty Organization for those countries that are involved with communist Soviet Union. In the meantime, you see Mao Zedong, who is the communist leader of China, or in China. You see him fighting off the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek, and he's losing more and more support every day. Chiang ends up being a corrupt politician. The United States continued to pump money in there to keep them from falling to communism, but he was ineffectual, he was unpopular, and as your book points out, he was corrupt. So in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek fled for a new home, trying to get out of Dodge. Mao's now in power and remains so until 1976. April 1949 is when the Soviet Union tested their first successful atomic bomb, which leads us into a more sophisticated version of the atomic age. In April 1950, the National Security Council in the United States issued a report called NSC 68, which you need to know for your test. This is what outlines the American foreign policy that essentially says nobody can stand up to communism besides us. If we don't do it, no one else will, and it's of vital interest to our security that we do that exact thing. I'll be back with Chapter 3.